Hello, this is the Fiction Nonfiction Podcast from Literary Hub, where we believe that every issue in your social media feed or on the evening news has already been tackled somewhere in literature. I'm Whitney Terrell, the author of the novel The Good Lieutenant.
And I'm Vivi Ganeshananthan, also known as Sugi, the author of the novel Brotherless Night.
So this is an episode that our current interns at the University of Missouri, Kansas City chose, and we are covering something a little different today, which is the literature of QAnon.
We must be using an extremely loose definition of literature, like do online posts.
Well, that's very snooty of you to say.
Our online posts and YouTube videos literature. Is that what we're talking about these days?
Maybe our interns feel that way. My sons particularly feel that way. But there are also a surprising number of books that come from the grifters and people within the QAnon world. Books on how to deal with, and they're also serious books like the one we're going to be talking about, but there are books on how to deal with family members who get sucked into QAnon, and literature that informed and misinformed, more accurately, some of the core beliefs within that conspiracy theory. So there's a whole literary backdrop here.
So for our listeners who are not terminally online, QAnon is the anti-Semitic, cult-like grand conspiracy that says elites drink children's blood, where Donald Trump is a messiah-like figure who's going to bring, quote, the storm that rights all their perceived wrongs of the world. Do I have all of that? Did I get everything?
Yeah, I mean, there's some other stuff, space lasers causing wildfires in California. Tom Hanks is a pedophile. Vaccines have microchips. And there's it goes on and on. Yeah, but you're in the ballpark.
So it's like Thomas Pynchon, but on the right.
I don't think Thomas Pynchon would appreciate that, but probably QAnon wouldn't either. Fortunately, we do have someone who knows everything there is to know about QAnon, and that person is Will Sommer, who's been covering QAnon in its dark corners of the internet since it started.
Will Sommer is a politics reporter for the Daily Beast and the co-host of the podcast Fever Dreams. His work covering QAnon and other conspiracy theories has been featured in multiple documentaries, including HBO's Q, Into the Storm. He's the author of Trust the Plan, The Rise of QAnon and the Conspiracy That Unhinged America, which is a HarperCollins book that just came out in February. Well, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
So your book opens up with a sort of step-by-step. I wrote in the script TikTok, but then I didn't want to get TikTok involved in this. But a step-by-step explanation of how QAnon got started. Could you give our listeners a brief gloss on the high points, just to sort of get them situated in time?
Absolutely. So in October 2017, this figure named Q starts posting on this anonymous message board called 4chan. And Q is we don't know Q's identity, but Q's supporters come to believe that it's someone close to Donald Trump, maybe his social media guy, Dan Scavino, maybe it's Don Jr. And they think Q is posting coded messages to sort of alert us to the world as it really is. And so that Q pops up and he says, Hillary Clinton will be arrested by the end of the month, for example. And so these messages spin out and sort of create this whole worldview and this conspiracy theory, which briefly summed up is that the world is controlled by a satanic pedophile cabal featuring everyone from Oprah Winfrey to Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton to Tom Hanks. And that these people drink children's blood and participate in satanic rituals and eat children. And that the second half of that is that Donald Trump is going to take these people down. There's going to be this big moment called the storm when some of the people I mentioned go to Guantanamo Bay and the rest of us live in a sort of utopian Trump dictatorship. So, it's a lot. Even that is a lot. And QAnon gets much crazier than that. But that sort of sums up what they believe.
Oh my God, the high points. The cliff notes.
Well, see, it sounds so dumb when you describe it. They have spent so much time not saying what it actually is sort of what I think that it's like the literary device of like actually not only hinting at that bad stuff. When you summarize it, it sounds so insane.
Exactly. I mean, they're very, when I interview QAnon people at rallies and stuff, they say, well, I'm just interested in the corruption. And I say, well, what do you mean by the corruption? They say, all right, let me tell you about the mole children, stuff like that. And so that's certainly been my experience.
So I'm just like, when you're reporting on this, you have to, I don't know, like not exactly keep a straight face, but sort of like, right, you have to give us that whole gloss, like pretty straightforwardly. It sounds like a distinctive reporting challenge.
It is. It is. I mean, certainly, you don't want to be just constantly reacting and saying, well, that's just ridiculous. I mean, even though, the book opens with me interviewing a woman at January 6th who is saying things like, I'm interested in rescuing children, I believe it are held in tunnels deep underground and all this stuff. And so I say a lot of things like, well, that's interesting, or I've never thought about it that way. And, you kind of just write it down. And then afterwards, you sort of have to lock into that mindset. And, for me, one of the interesting challenges of this job is sort of following these ideological strands. And when, ultimately these people are often sort of playing in a land of make believe. I mean, I think about these QAnon factions that will say, the people who think John F. Kennedy Jr. is still alive, they're ridiculous. We're the serious evidence-based QAnon believers. But then, so they have these sort of fascinating disagreements, but then it results in things like January 6th or these murders or all these just bizarre things. And so for me, it's been, it's a very interesting sort of thing to follow.
Yeah. And it is actually, as you say, really serious. And in your book, you note that Hunter S. Thompson's fear and loathing in Las Vegas plays a role in a core tenet of QAnon. And we are a podcast that claims that everything you see in your social media feed has already been written about in literature. So our antenna went up at that reference. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, this is really interesting. So a core part of QAnon belief is that, why is this cabal? Why do they want to control the world? What are they doing? And it is that they believe that these world elites are sexually torturing children in satanic rituals because this is the only way to get children to produce this substance called adrenochrome, which they sort of drain from their brains. And again, millions of people believe this. That
I'm learning to keep my face straight.
Exactly. You're kind of in a situation like I am. I feel like I'm in the QAnon believer role here. So they think that essentially this substance is like the fountain of youth, and that you can, this is why our celebrities they don't have wrinkles and stuff. Now, obviously, this is called Botox, right? But in their case, they believe this is adrenochrome. But adrenochrome is a real thing, and it is it's a substance that comes from just oxidizing adrenaline. It's sort of a useless kind of thing to have. But the Hunter S. Thompson connection here is that in the 60s and the 70s, this was because it sounds cool, right? It sounds like the ultimate drug or something. In Fear and Loathing on Las Vegas, he is, with his lawyer, and the lawyer's giving him all these drugs, and he says, "Here's adrenochrome. This is this crazy drug, and you can only get it from a pedophile." And so that is sort of the origin of this idea of adrenochrome as this kind of satanic drug that's popular with pedophiles, and this kind of the ultimate drug. And that is where they get it from. And so to the extent that if you watch a YouTube clip of Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, it's now all these people saying, Q was right. This is real.
I do really love that Hunter S. Thompson is somehow the source for this.
Yes.
Speaking of conspiracy theories, I did have like an ex-wife of my uncle dated him for a while. So that's my Hunter S. Thompson connection. He was a crazy guy. Drinking the blood of children, how to make a good transition. Drinking the blood of children sounds like a centuries-old anti-Semitic, like the centuries-old anti-Semitic blood libel myths, where supposedly rabbis drank the blood of children, and the grand global conspiracy aspect has similar themes to the discredited protocols of the Elders of Zion. Speaking of other precursor, not exactly literary text to this, it's a fake propaganda document that's supposed to be the meeting of the minutes of a meeting where Jewish leaders conspire to control the world. So is QAnon just a form of repackaged anti-Semitism for a new generation, or is there more to it than that?
I think there's more to it, but really at its core, it does have this sort of anti-Semitic animus at its center. I mean, you mentioned here the Jewish blood libel, which was something I was not familiar with until I started reporting on QAnon. This idea dating back to, I think, the 13th century that rabbis were kidnapping Gentile children and basically grinding them up and using their blood for matzah bread. And so this idea is now we sort of go to the 21st century, where we have this idea that people like George Soros, these other prominent Jewish people, are once again drinking children's blood. And this is not just a sort of an echo of it. I mean, often, you kind of have varying degrees of QAnon, quote unquote, evidence. But when they start saying, here's the proof of it, it often is that they dig up the protocols of the Council of Elders of Zion, or some neo-Nazis writings from the 70s that refer all the way back to the Middle Ages. And so it really is, I think, before you kind of really start digging in, they don't say, this is about Jewish people, but, they sort of pitch themselves as this non-racist patriotic movement. But when you start getting deeper into it, that's really what it's based on.
So speaking of anti-Semitism, I had, you guys, Sugi is going to be surprised at this transition. I was thinking last night about high modernist poets like T.S. Eliot, also rumored to be anti-Semite, or Ezra Pound,
Well, certainly.
or Wallace Stevens, usually men, but not only. I mean, you could talk about Sylvia Plath's work this way, where like the whole cool thing about the poetry was that it was hard to understand and had weird illusions, and there's a whole backstory, and you had to know the Bhagavad Gita, and you had to know all this sort of stuff to understand the wasteland, right? And that there's a pleasure in that, right? Like generations of English professors have lived off the pleasure of interpreting difficult texts. And I wonder to what extent this is part of what's happening also with QAnon, because I'm going to read a passage that you quote in the book for like the second QAnon post that is like, to me, read like modernist poetry. So here it is. Mockingbird. HRC detained, not arrested yet. Where's Huma? Follow Huma. This has nothing to do with Russia yet. Why does POTUS surround himself with generals? What is military intelligence? Why go around the three-letter agencies? All right, I'm not going to read any more than that. but to what extent is this like a form of like high school English interpretation? But for people who are far right.
I think that's a great point. I mean, I think it's a very similar interest. I mean, I remember sitting in eighth grade or, in high school class with one of those giant, Norton anthologies and flipping through the wasteland. And, you see all the footnotes and what have you. I mean, I think so much of the pleasure and it gets, I mean, that's one of the more comprehensible ones. I mean, it gets deep. There are references to books in QAnon, plenty of movies. They love talking about really random movies. And so I think it is that joy of what they call it, the decoding or the baking, because they say they're putting together these breadcrumbs. And I think that is it's sort of like a treasure hunt, or it's they're going through all these illusions. I think also, I mean, it really, am I losing my train of thought here? I think I did.
Well, you say in there that there's a meaning behind all of those lines that I read that don't mean anything to me. Like, for instance, Mockingbird 10/30/17. I don't know what that means, but you say that there is a meaning for that. That's an illusion.
Yeah, so let's talk about Mockingbird. That's a great example. So that could mean so many things, right? Well, I think generally most QAnon believers would say that is a reference to the CIA's Operation Mockingbird, which was something in the 60s in which some newspaper columnists were on the CIA payroll. The implication being, that the CIA now controls the media. And so it is one of these sort of I think Mockingbird's a great example of it because it is this it sounds pretty and it what does it mean, and it there's something. Oh, the other thing I would add about it is, like some of these great poems you're mentioning, you can have such wildly different interpretations. And so I think part of the appeal of QAnon is that people can say, well, this is about Operation Mockingbird, or they could say, here's a picture of Hillary Clinton at a bird sanctuary, and maybe it's about that. I mean, there's all these different layers you can do to it, and often I think they just have fun arguing about it, and sort of, you can. There's no real one interpretation.
So yeah, it's true, Whitney. I did not see that transition coming. And maybe if we had funded the humanities a little bit better, these people would have something else to do.
They could all be English majors, and then they would be looking at Wall Stevens. It's so much more useful.
In the room, the women come and go talking about who the fuck knows what.
That's proof rock.
I mean, it's a great example. I mean, there are a lot of sort of failed, I think, people with humanities aspirations involved in QAnon. In the book, I talk about a guy who's a failed screenwriter who sort of instead turns his powers towards creating these QAnon worlds. So,
the reach and influence of QAnon, you mentioned before, like kind of the identity or the theorizing behind who Q, this great poet is. And there was a book written in 1999 by a group of Italian activist pranksters titled Q that has some similar motifs. What do you think that book's connection to QAnon is, and how does that play into any of your theories?
Yeah, this is really cool. This is I love how y'all are getting into the literary aspects of it. As you said, I mean, there's this group, and now they're called the Wu Ming Foundation. I'm not sure what their title was at the time, but this was a group of these '90s pranksters in Italy, these left wing kind of anarchists, and they would stage these sort of like, I don't know if you would call them happenings. I mean, these weird hoaxes. They would stage, satanic events in their cities, or they would. I think they had like an orangutan that they claimed, could speak English, and it would travel the continent, and it was all a hoax. I mean, all this fun stuff. And they wrote this book called Q, which was about the Reformation and this character who's sort of being chased across Europe by an inquisitor. And so initially, and there's codes in it and some cryptic aspects. And so, some reporters said, well, this is obviously about, this is the inspiration for QAnon. I think it would later turn out to just be that, we have 26 letters in the alphabet and Q is used in both of these. But it was interesting talking to these guys who were behind this and saying, obviously, we're not behind QAnon, and, this really has nothing to do with how we see things. But nevertheless, I mean, there were this echo of this idea. I mean, some similar aspects of these kind of arch sort of medieval or these great debates about religion, that I think now we see refracted in this kind of very modern way in QAnon.
Don't we sort of know who Q is now? I mean, haven't there been some fairly credible accusations about who that is? And if so, could you outline that for our listeners who might not have been following that story?
Absolutely. And so, this is obviously the first question people have is who's Q? And so I think it's laid out pretty comprehensively in the HBO documentary Q Into the Storm. The best argument I've seen, I don't think we've nailed it down 100%, but I think it's pretty solid, is that Q is run by a father and son duo named Ron and Jim Watkins, who run this anonymous website called 8chan out of the Philippines. And that essentially they hijacked QAnon because they love stirring up internet mischief and promoting conspiracy theories. And that, I mean, it's worth noting that they deny this, but I think in this documentary, one of them more or less confesses. So that mystery, I think, is essentially solved. But, QAnon keeps rolling forward, and the believers say, well, maybe Q was a guy in his mom's basement, effectively, but what he taught us is real. And, what we've learned, that the stuff about the adrenochrome and the dungeons, what have you, that's all legitimate.
Yeah, we want to talk about that, the sort of cottage industry, and you talk about this as well, that is particularly the literary cottage industry that's around the QAnon phenomenon. So, people are creating content based off this original two guys who probably wrote the posts. And there's been at least one Amazon bestseller. Suki and I can't speak for Suki. I've never had an Amazon bestseller, although I write books. It's very hard. So how did they pull this off?
Yeah, I mean, one thing covering the right and the right-wing media is fascinating how much money goes into it. And really, you mentioned here the case of this QAnon bestseller. I mean, this was, any sort of aspiring author, you're always checking the Amazon charts and, dreaming of being at number 15 or number 1, what have you. And certainly in this case, I mean, reporters were looking at the Amazon charts and they said, there's like a QAnon book at number 10 right there. And so this was a group of QAnon conspiracy theorists who were among sort of the first QAnon promoters. And they got together one day and said, our websites are too hard to understand. Why don't we just publish this all in a book? And I got to say, having read the book, it's not a very good book, right? It's a bunch of, if you imagine... right. So I wouldn't recommend it for a LitHub pick. But, if you take a bunch of internet posts and compile them, it's really hard to read, but they nevertheless, I mean, they made easily, I would say, hundreds of thousands of dollars off of it. And then, as you often have with co-authors, there was a falling out, arguments over who was getting money, the rights, and a sequel, all this stuff. But it is fascinating to see them sort of participate in the regular book industry. Another QAnon promoter was able to raise more than $200,000 to crowdfund one of his books. And again, not an instant classic, but it sold a lot of copies as well.
So where does that kind of fall into? I mean, we've seen people debate things like, should publishers be buying memoirs or books by political figures who have pushed theories that are obviously untrue? Are these QAnon books, or this QAnon book in particular, like, this is self-published? Like, this is what kinds of, like, are these people are not sending out agent query letters?
Right. I mean, in this case, in the case of this best-selling one, this was there was I believe she was in Mexico. There was an American expat in Mexico who was somehow familiar with how publishing works and was able to sort of cobble together this self-published book for these QAnon people and get it up there. So yes, as you said, this was not a big five publication.
So, I mean,
Still,
that's
I mean,
interesting 'cause it's
Wallace
just like
Stevens never made $200,000 off of the Emperor of Ice
this
Cream,
is
I
this
don't think.
this is kind of what I mean, right? Like, if it is so lucrative, when is the moment that the big five are going to be like, well, we need the money? Like, where is that line drawn?
I mean, certainly you do see. I mean, I think publishers engaging in publishing conspiracy theories. I mean, I think QAnon it was a bit too far, and certainly after I think there was this backlash for Amazon having this book, and so they delisted it. And ultimately, even for my book, we had to make clear, for example, with the subtitle, that this was not a pro QAnon book, because that was a concern from some vendors, was that you have a big old Q on it, and it says the book is called Trust the Plan, and so they wanted to make clear, and if you're sitting on the subway, that people won't think you're a QAnon believer if you're reading it.
That also seems to pose probably some challenges for the cover designer.
Yes.
So there are a number of opportunistic grifters in this QAnon space, and in the book, you talk about a guy that QAnon believers think is JFK Jr., which you mentioned, and someone even wrote this comic book where he's the hero.
Even more literature.
Yeah,
we count graphic novels as literature now, don't we?
Is the comic book good?
No. Again, I think we're still waiting for that QAnon classic that's going to emerge from this. But no, it is not. I mean, the amount of, to be frank, dreck I had to go through for this book, because often, the insights people offer when they're writing these books are very interesting. I mean, well, often they're sort of telling their stories of how they came to QAnon or what role it filled in their life, but they think it's a great thing. And so for me, I mean, it's invaluable to go through this stuff. But again, I mean, I really would skip this comic book.
Okay. All right. So you did mention this guy earlier. We're going to have you read to us a short passage about Robert Cornero, who's this failed screenwriter who was a former grocery store clerk who found an outlet in QAnon. And those are the people. That's the guy who his followers crowdfunded to write a book, gave him $160K advance, which is not bad. Would you read that passage to us? Then we'll talk about it afterward.
Yeah, so I'm talking here about this guy who became a sort of prominent QAnon promoter, and was fascinating to me because, and I think is especially relevant for this podcast, because unlike a lot of them, he could write, to some extent, and so he really was able to sort of imbue sort of as we're going to find, sort of a place as a sort of kind of classic loser, and become kind of a big QAnon star through the power of writing. Okay. To the people who knew him in the real world in the spring of 2018, Robert Cornero seemed to be going nowhere. In his early 30s, he lived with his parents and had just lost a position as a grocery store clerk in the same New Jersey strip mall where he got his first job in middle school. The height of drama in Cornero's life had been a feud with his bosses over whether he could run the store's frozen food section. He met a woman online who lived thousands of miles away in Canada, but she dumped him after her father called him a loser. When Cornero turned on his computer, though, he was a star. Tens of thousands of people were waiting to hear what he had to say. Just by setting up a website in February 2018, Robert Cornero had become Neon Revolt, a powerful QAnon blogger able to shape how millions of people saw the world. Before, Cornero's life had been in a long-term decline. His troubles began in his last months at a prestigious medical high school in 2004, when he tried to impress a girl by listing the ways he would murder his classmates. Police raided Cornero's locker. He was banned from prom. In his final years in high school, Cornero developed a fascination with movies. The passion grew, Cornero claimed, after a doctor told him he was too handsome to work in medicine, urging him to go to Hollywood instead. After narrowly avoiding prosecution in the shooting threat incident, Cornero moved to Los Angeles to sell his screenplays. But as with so many hopefuls before him, Hollywood success eluded Cornero. He scored some minor accolades, winning second place in an online screenwriting contest with an action comedy script he billed as Clerks meets Army of Darkness. But Cornero felt like a failure in a town that, as far as he could see, was full of winners. While rival screenwriters earned accolades, Cornero was stuck in LA traffic driving a car with a broken air conditioner. Leonard, Jeez Louise.
Just say who it is.
Yeah, sure. Should I just say that like conversationally or
Yeah.
in the, okay, sure.
Yeah, you can just say, break in.
And so then we introduce this character called Franklin Leonard, who is the creator of the Hollywood Blacklist, which is a list of unproduced screenplays that is very influential. Stuff like Slumdog Millionaire has been on it. And so for Cornero, this was sort of seen as the gold standard. If only he could make this list, put out by Franklin Leonard. Back to the book here. Leonard, who often spoke about using the blacklist to promote diversity in Hollywood, was a symbol of the forces that Cornero thought had stopped him from succeeding, even though the two men never had any direct interaction. The industry, even during that time, had grown increasingly hostile to straight white men, Cornero recalled later. In time, Cornero gave up on Los Angeles and moved back to his New Jersey hometown, but he still seethed at the industry that had rejected him. At one point, he tweeted that someone should burn the whole degenerate town down. With seemingly endless amounts of time to spend on the internet after his grocery store shifts, Cornero cycled through political ideologies. He embraced Ron Paul's libertarian presidential bids, then moved on to Gamergate. All of his rage at his Hollywood failures pushed him onto 4chan in 2014, frequenting a place where users attempted to radicalize one another into extremist ideologies with what they called red pills. They would show each other a depressing, often skewed statistic, say the long odds millennials face to buy a home, or figures purporting to show that the deck was stacked against white men. The posts were meant to make people angry, and they worked on Cornero. I was surrounded by a vampiric culture of death, knee-deep in the dead, and I was determined to fight my way out, even if I had to slog through the bowels of hell to get there, Cornero recalled later. Inspired by 4chan, Cornero launched a Facebook page to share more negative memes. Soon, Cornero recalled, he had 70,000 followers, and 4chan's nihilism coursing through my veins. Cornero was delighted by how quickly he had seized some level of internet prominence, and devoted himself to making more memes. A frequent 4chan user, Cornero encountered Q in its earliest days, shortly after losing his job at the grocery store. Cornero started posting on 4chan about QAnon, attracting more fans to his page. When Facebook banned Neon Revolt, Cornero moved to a group on the far-right social network Gab and launched his Neon Revolt blog, which soon became a hub for QAnon activity. As his fame grew, Cornero started crowdfunding to publish a book about his QAnon ideas. His eager fans donated nearly $160,000 to the cause, expecting to hear his proof that QAnon was real and that the storm would soon arrive. What they may not have anticipated were dozens of pages about Cornero's own life and his radicalization from little-known frozen food clerk to QAnon figurehead. Cornero stood out among QAnon promoters because he could write more than a few dozen words at a time. His Neon Revolt persona succeeded where his Hollywood scripts had failed. Okay, I think that was it.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is the first time I've been able to read it out loud, so that's fun.
It's great. I mean, we're talking about all of this QAnon produced dreck, and I'm so happy that we also get to showcase your fabulous book. So as much as I distrust QAnon, I can definitely identify with how painful it is when your writing is not accepted or recognized, and how much of QAnon's appeal is just as a refuge for people who feel rejected by mainstream society. I feel like I hear, right, there's so much in there that also connects to other topics we've discussed on the show, or just you ask kind of, here are people who feel disenfranchised. Like, is it rural people? Is it white people? Is it men? Is it the Republican Party? Like, just how does this kind of fit into that? And what does it mean if you feel yourself boxed out of something like a competitive skill like screenwriting? How is this opening up parallel? I'm not sure that it's exactly parallel avenues to success.
Sure. I mean, excuse me. I think QAnon often appeals to people who feel marginalized, rightly or wrongly. I mean, they feel that they're not being respected, and sometimes that's because they have real problems in their lives, and sometimes they feel that maybe they're a white man, and they feel that, as in the case of Robert Cornero, that they are sort of being denied something because minorities have taken it from them, and so. QAnon gives them a sort of meaning to their lives. I mean, even if you're living a relatively comfortable, perhaps mundane life, QAnon offers you a chance to really rise above your station. They call themselves digital soldiers. I mean, so that rather than goofing off online, suddenly this becomes, you're in an army and you're saving the children, just by posting, frankly. I mean, and ideally they keep it there. I mean, sometimes they take it much more seriously and more violently. But I think it gives people a meaning. We were talking about the clue aspect of it. I mean, that they can really dive into. I mean, they call it going down the rabbit hole. And so you sort of go into this whole new world. And I think it particularly for the leaders of it, I think it gives them a lot of prestige that they really would never have enjoyed in their normal lives.
So just
I
as
mean,
you're
you can.
talking, I'm thinking about my friend Dave Farenthold covered covered Trump, and he mobilized, like, through social media, all of these people who were also doing kind of like puzzle making, right, and detective work, kind of in this collaborative way. It's like, what makes someone go that way versus this way? Like, you could be the person who's like, oh, I spotted the painting of Trump in this space, this is what you're looking for. Or you could be the person who's like, like, I've seen the person drinking the blood of children. Like, I don't, like, why?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great comparison. We really are sort of in that age of sort of crowdsourced intelligence, crowdsourced reporting. I think often the kind of the classic QAnon believer is someone we think about as a Trump rally goer. They're whiter, they're older, they're more likely to be evangelical Christian. That changed during the pandemic. We saw a lot more women, younger people, people of color getting into it. But I do think it's often sort of your priors that direct you into QAnon. I mean, certainly a lot of people got into it because they were already involved in these very kind of charismatic churches where they thought, like, the devil's a real guy, he's a real force, and suddenly you have this story sort of laying out how you too can fight satanic forces in the real world. And that's just one example. I mean, it is, so much respect for David's work. I think it's also a bit more appealing for people that think that they're, gonna, I mean, there is also, I was gonna say that there's this sort of utopian aspect to QAnon that they think that, once you help Donald Trump bring about this new world, I mean, all debts are going to be abolished, diseases are going to be cured. And so I think for a lot of people, there was also this very personal aspect of, like, I am getting something out of this.
Well, also, not everyone can be a screenwriter. I mean, it's an exceedingly competitive business, right? And so if you have someone, and the weird thing about writing is that everyone thinks they can do it because they can actually type, and that's all it's not like becoming a doctor, right? And so you have someone who, rather than admit, like, I'm not good enough at this and try to figure out why, there's a convenient reason. Oh, it's because I'm white and the industry is biased against me, which is insane, of course, because, there are a bit, Hollywood is still dominated by white male writers. I mean, that's, so that's really a positive for him, not a negative, right? But he can't admit to himself, this Robert Cornero guy you're reading about, that he's not good enough. And so he finds a parallel world where he can be good enough by having no talent, because there's nobody really with talent competing there, is what it seems like to me.
Well, thank you for hitting on that. That was the other thing I wanted to bring up. I mean, it is often sort of an explanation for the misfortunes or as you said. I mean, maybe this, it's just you couldn't cut it, and so this is an easy explanation for saying, well, I actually am that great, except the cabal is against me. I mean, there's a lot of failed actors and musicians involved in QAnon as well, and for them, it's often they look at, let's say, someone who succeeded, and they say, well, that guy had to join the cabal. I mean, I don't want to eat the kids. And that's why they couldn't, why I don't have success and this person does.
So, if you are the person whose kid is in the basement crusading, you've got a tough task. And in the book, you write about the personal and emotional cost that families go through trying to get a loved one to give up on QAnon. And in particular, you share some correspondence you had with a father dealing with a son deep into QAnon. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. I mean, for me, this is one of the sort of the most the least visible tragedies of QAnon, which are just these families and relationships that are just destroyed by it. In this case, I followed a family for a year as their son, who was in his 20s, gets into QAnon, and essentially this father had reached out to me and said, how do I get my kid out of QAnon? I mean, he's getting really into it. And this person who I thought I knew, who was just, my wonderful son, is, slipping into unreality. And in this case, it started with him saying, Dad, I just want you to know they're going to be arresting some celebrities soon. And he said, oh, okay, well, as long as it's not Tom Selleck, like Magnum PI. And then, it accelerated from there. I mean, his son sort of stayed inside all the time, just Googling about QAnon. And, started arguing with his parents and, saying, why can't you see how obvious this is, that QAnon is real and all this? And it's really a tragic story. I mean, and I think, unfortunately, it's played out really across the country.
So there are a good number of books and articles out there on how to deal with a loved one who is sucked into the orbit of QAnon. What is your advice? And is it possible to extract someone from this?
It's really tough. I mean, and it is, I think, sort of the person often has to rescue themselves. I mean, it's from the ex-QAnon believers I talk to, there's always sort of an idiosyncratic thing that one particular bit of Q evidence that they really placed all their faith in. And then when that is disproven, for example, they might say that, well, Donald Trump tweeted at 2:17 and Q is the 17th number of the alphabet. And then when you show them all the times he tweets that it's not 17 minutes on the hour, then, that shakes them. I mean, it is such strange stuff because it is such a strange belief system. Unfortunately, there really is not a step-by-step guide that I think works. I think the only advice is to, evaluate how much you care about this relationship. If it's a random person on Facebook, you can probably move on with your life. But of course, if it's a spouse or a relative, you probably want to stick with them. And to just try to get them offline as much as possible, which is, easier said than done in the age of smartphones. But to sort of hopefully at best move them on to a non-QAnon obsession. I mean, in the case of this family, once the son got a girlfriend and, once he got into Bigfoot, he at least it started to move on from QAnon.
Oh, those were the days when Bigfoot was what people did conspiracy theories about. So much more innocent. Well, Will, thanks so much for joining us. I'm a fan of your podcast, Fever Dreams, which you co-host with Kelly Weil. And we encourage our listeners to go out and pick up Trust the Plan, The Rise of QAnon, and The Conspiracy That Unhinged America, which is out now.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for joining us.
All right.